on that fact. It has to be based on the fact God is sovereign. And He has been sovereign in your marriage. Because so many people today don't believe that, so they think that somehow they can get a loophole out of their marriage because they just made the wrong choice. A young couple came to a dear friend of mine out in Texas who's got quite a wit about him, and they came to the pastor and they said, Pastor, we've decided it wasn't God's will when we got married. And he said, well, maybe it wasn't God's will then, but it's God's will now. Listen, life and God's work is not about you getting your best life now, even though a man who does the will of God will find his best life possible. But it's not about you getting your best life now. What it's about you being conformed to the image of Christ. You go talk to a brother, a dear friend of mine, who coming back from the mission field, his wife and 2 children were going to pick him up at the airport. When he arrived, someone else met him at the airport because his wife was killed on the way. You go tell him that it's all about his best life now. You go tell a man whose body is screaming at him with pain every time he moves, and tell him it's all about his best life now. You talk to a man who has married a very, very difficult woman, or a woman who's married a very, very difficult man that's literally put her life through hell, and tell her it's all about her best life now. Or come to her with something stronger. Come to your own self with something stronger. God is sovereign in my life. And no matter what is going on, there's a purpose in it, and God is using it for the greatest good, and that is to conform me to the image of Christ. Now, marriage is just like a calling. It is a calling. It's not only a calling, but the basis of it is a calling. My marriage, the rock foundation of my marriage is this. God has called Paul Washer with an irrevocable calling to lay down his life for a daughter of his named Cz.2. That's it. That's the foundation. God has called me to lay down my life for a certain daughter of his. That's it. That's the basis of my marriage. Now, you've heard the stories. They don't tell them as much anymore as they used to about, that man was called to preach, and he's just walked away from the pulpit, and he's not preaching. God's going to kill him. You can't deny your calling. Once you've been called to preach, you don't preach, God will kill you. We always hear those stories. Well, I don't know if God will kill him, but I know he'd enter into a time of discipline, that's for sure. That's right. But I know this. What makes you think that your calling's any different? You have been called to be a steward of a daughter, God's daughter. Let's say you worked for my company and you were a young salesman and you were the worst thing that ever hit my company. I'm probably going to have pity on you, even though you're the worst worker I've ever had, and try to bring you along a little bit. I'm not going to fire you right off the bat. But if you were married to my daughter and you were the best salesman in my company, 90% of all the income came from you, and you were married to my daughter, and I found out you were mistreating my daughter, I wouldn't care how much my company depended on you. Don't think that your ministry is that important. Don't think that even what you do in the church is this overarching, the instrument or means by which God is going to judge you. Think about this. If a man worked for you and didn't do a good job, you'd have pretty much mercy on him, wouldn't you? If he mistreated your daughter, well, just realize something. The woman you're married to is somebody's daughter, and that somebody is God. And He loves her with a zeal and a passion that we cannot understand. Pity the man who touches God's daughter. God has entrusted you with a daughter. And it doesn't matter how good she is or how difficult she is. It doesn't matter anything. He has entrusted you with a daughter. And no selfish, self-centered excuse is going to wash. He's given you a daughter. He has sovereignly given you His daughter. And He expects you to do what He commands you to do with regard to His daughter, and that is lay down your life for her. But here's the thing that I want you to understand. You know all these dating services that find you a mate that's compatible? I can tell you right now, they're not God's will. Why? Because for the most part, it's not God's will to give you a mate that's compatible. Do you feel better now about your marriage, don't you? You're going, whoa, this is a revelation. Here this whole time, I thought I would... No. It's not God's will. By and large, God will give you a mate that is strong in all the areas where she must be strong so that you are not tempted beyond what you can bear. And I could say the same thing for her. But God has also given you a mate where He has carefully orchestrated, sovereignly been over her weaknesses. He has given you a woman who is weak in many of the areas where you most want her to be strong. Now think about this. God has specifically given you a woman that is weak and lacking in many of the areas where you most wanted her not to be weak and lacking. I don't know about you, but this is a great comfort. Now, why has He done that? To conform you to the image of Christ. Now, when we talk about being conformed to the image of Christ, when you think about Jesus Christ, what are the characteristics that most just pop into your head? What are the ones we sing about? I mean, we don't sing a whole lot about the wrath of Jesus, even though He does have wrath, the wrath of the Lamb. We don't sing a whole lot about these things. What do we sing about? We sing about His unconditional love, His mercy, His compassion, His pity, His grace, don't we? Those are the things that just stand, and they ought to. Don't think you're wrong. They ought to stand out. All right, so you becoming like Christ doesn't mean just that you dot all the I's and cross all the T's. It means that you reflect these things that He most reflects. Now, let me ask you a question. How can you ever learn unconditional love if you're married to a wife who meets all the conditions? If you were married to a woman that met every condition that your selfish heart put forward, would you ever learn unconditional love? If you were married to a perfect woman, would you ever learn mercy? Would you ever learn grace? No! Don't you see? God's wisdom is so much greater than ours. The only question you have to ask yourself is, what do you want? Do you want what God wants, which is to be made conformed to the image of Christ, or do you want what the worldly man wants? A woman that's 5'10", weighs 6 pounds, and has 6-figure salary. What do you want? The perfect woman, the trophy wife, this, that. What do you want? If your heart is right, you want to be conformed to the image of Christ. And so, in these things that the world tells you, your marriage might not be right because there's so much incompatibility. You're not compatible. Your wife doesn't like to do some of the things you like to do. Your wife's personality is different than yours. Your wife may be difficult, almost as difficult as you, and back and forward, and you're wondering, is my marriage even God's will? Have I been stuck with some kind of a thing that really doesn't work for me? Like other guys who get better marriages, and me, I've just got the short end of the stick. Well, if you're thinking that way, I can guarantee it's your wife that got the short end of the stick. But what you need to see is, no, this has been perfectly orchestrated. God knows exactly what you need to be conformed to His image. Now, I don't like talking this way because it kind of lends to the fact that we're these really superior guys who God is working in, and so He gives us a wife that has some problems. But if I was teaching the women, I'd be saying the same thing, don't you see? She has also been given a man who is strong in the areas where he must be strong, that she's not tempted beyond what she can bear, but whose weaknesses are also sovereignly orchestrated, that she might learn to love as Christ loves. This is wonderful, though, because it shows us that our marriages are right.